It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person was torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
G'day listeners and welcome to Hard Hats and High Vis, the podcast that refuses to wear either. While digging through the entrails of the Australian federal election, the election has been won and lost, but there's still so much going on that we're hanging in there. And we'd like to remind our listeners to help us spread the news of Hard Hats and High Vis. Give us a review on your podcast app and give us a jump on social media if you like what you're listening to. You can drop me a line on Twitter at Jack the Insider, or send us a letter to the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com. We would love to hear from you, and your correspondence may even end up in the show, including a little bit that we've got at the end of today's show. So here we are. I'm Jack the Insider, Peter hoisted to my mum, and joining me today as per his Hong Kong Jack. G'day, Jack.
G'day, Jack.
Well, mate, the shadow cabinet has been announced, and it would seem that many of the Morrison acolytes have been given their marching orders, or at least demoted. We might remember Stuart Robert, the outgoing Minister for Social Security, who had the most expensive internet available in Australia. He's gone. As well as people like Linda Reynolds. God, she had to go. Alex Hawke has been demoted. Melissa Price, Keith Pitt, Andrew G. have been given their marching orders. Have you had a good look at the shadow cabinet list?
Oh, I've cast my eye over it. It doesn't really matter a great deal, does it? They're just spokespeople for the moment, you know.
Maurice Payne, the outgoing Minister for Foreign Affairs, had asked not to be considered for a prominent role. I believe she is the spokesperson assisting the Prime Minister.
Perhaps she's going for a holiday in the South Seas where she didn't go when perhaps she ought to. You know.
Fiji, you think?
Yeah.
You think, Jack? Yeah, Fiji and
Solomons,
maybe.
Fiji, the Tonga, anywhere up there. Yeah. 10
of the 24 member shadow cabinet are women. The 24 shadow spokespeople are women, including Deputy Suzanne Lee. Jane Hume has been given a promotion, and Andrew Hastie, who was lucky enough, he had a swing against him in WA, Jack, well below the 10% average. I think it was about 6.5%. So he's got a bit of a personal following there in his seat.
He goes okay, I think, Andrew Hastie.
I think
he's the former SAS chappie, isn't he?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think he showed himself in the Robert Smith trial to be a person of pretty substantial integrity. And also, in regard to his remarks on China, that a lot of people thought were a bit extreme initially, but I think he sort of got China fairly right. But how does Dutton handle opposition now? What does he have to do?
Well, I think Dutton's a pretty good choice as opposition leader. But we have to remember that hasn't been a single instance where we have changed government in Australia and the losing party has appointed a new opposition leader, and that opposition leader has gone on to be Prime Minister. Not one.
Not one. Yes, Kim Beazley. Brendan Nelson.
Yes. Billy Snedden.
Snedden, yes.
Going right back, you know.
Yeah, going back
Bill,
a bit.
Bill Shorten, you know.
So he's just making up the numbers, isn't he? So in a sense, historically anyway, history tells us that.
That's the probability. But what he's got to do is just gather the troops around him and form a bit of an opposition. And I think he's a good choice for that because he's an excellent communicator. Even when people don't like what he's saying, they actually know what he's saying. You know, it's always pretty clear and straightforward. Compare him to, say, Kim Beazley, where you were never quite sure what Kim was talking about. Or Bill Shorten, for that matter, not a great communicator, But the opposition leaders who go okay are the ones who can deliver a pretty consistent and straightforward message, and he's pretty good at that. The next thing they've got to do is forget all this stuff that's in the newspapers about whether you shift the Liberal Party to the left or the right, or whatever you do about that. The Liberal Party really only succeeds when it's a centre-right party that has both conservatives and moderates in it. And they can battle it out within the party, but that's what you need for the Liberal Party to succeed. And I think Dutton seems smart enough to work that out.
Look, I've written a couple of pieces about it now, and that's pretty much the way I'd go with these things. Any sort of shift away from the centre would be a disaster. Clearly, they were under attack from the centre, from the Teals in some of their blue ribbon seats. Seats like Frydenberg's Kooyong are gone, and McKellar, gone. Wentworth, perhaps not so much of a surprise, nor Sydney gone. I heard Malcolm Turnbull talk about this, and he makes a very good point. That's where they get their money, Jack. This has been the. Those seats have been where they make most of their money in terms of member donations.
Good Lord. Malcolm Turnbull making a good point. It must be about money.
Well, it's an obvious one, though, isn't it? That's what you lose. And you can't afford to basically consign those seats to oblivion.
But you have to remember that if you turned the Teals into a Teal party, there was absolutely no way that a Teal party could win government with their policies.
No, that's the get out. I mean, that's what they need to basically argue. They need to argue their points a little bit better than they did in the
because the Teal party, with their policies, their emphasis on climate change and the integrity of government, wouldn't win enough seats across the breadth of Australia to go anywhere near forming government. All the Teal party can do is win the richest 10 or 15 seats. At best, a Teal party could win the richest 10 or 15 seats in Australia.
It does cause all sorts of problems, but they can't. But what I'm saying to you is that the Liberal Party can't just, shrug their shoulders and then say, well, we'll pick those up in the suburbs or in regional Australia. That's a bizarre sort of way of thinking. And I did notice it was mentioned by the former member for Kew. I think he's still a current member for Kew, but he will has lost his pre-selection. Tim Smith, that great genius from Victoria, that he said that they need to give these areas up and go and fight in the suburbs. Tim Smith, he'd need to drive sober, but he'd need a map to find them, wouldn't he? Probably. The outer suburbs.
I don't think you give up. I don't think you give up suburbs, but I don't think you chase them in the same way that Labor hasn't ever really tried to chase to win Melbourne back. It just accepted the fact that Melbourne is a green enclave,
It's an interesting result in Melbourne this time around. Labor did pretty well in Melbourne this time around, and no one really saw that coming.
But Labor's been smart enough to say, look, we're not going to try and out-green Adam Bant in Melbourne with our policies overall, because if we do that, we won't win anywhere else. And that applies to the Teal. So, I actually think this is the first election where the pro-climate change party has really won for a while, The
climate war's over, mate. The climate war is over.
I don't think so. I think there is a really, really good argument that a good opposition leader could take to the next election, which is to say, look, just to keep saying, look, we're in favour of action on climate change, but not at the expense of jobs, not at the expense of coal mining, and not at the expense of living standards. And because that's where most of the population falls. They're okay about doing something about climate change, but not when it starts costing them money.
You might have read too that the overseeing body has recommended that electricity prices increase in Australia, Jack, and that recommendation came in to the government while they were campaigning, while they were in caretaker mode.
That would have been put in the bottom drawer anyway, you know.
And then Dutton, they certainly did, because they continued with this. Frydenberg and the Energy Minister Taylor were running around saying energy prices will be cheaper under the coalition. Well, they were sitting on that. That was straight out dishonest. And of course, Peter Dutton has kicked off his leadership by saying pretty much the same. It's a pretty shameful episode, really, that they did have this. They were sitting on this electricity prices rising. It's got to the point where some of the smaller retailers, Jack, are saying, please don't stick with us, because we won't be able to keep your electricity prices down, and you'll be looking at least 100% plus increases in your electricity through us.
Well, that's not going to change the debate on climate change in the teal seats, because nearly all the people in those seats can afford to pay it. And
that's right.
And you know, the classic image to me of the teal campaign. I keep seeing photos of brand new SUVs, Porsche Cayennes and whatever, pulling up outside somewhere, and people unloading the teal sandwich boards. And I thought, that's just perfect. You know, you can afford to pay extra. You can afford for your power. You can afford to pay extra for your petrol. But those same factors don't work once you go past what's the curtain wall in Sydney? South Dowling Street.
South Dowling Street might be a little bit broader than that now.
Yeah.
I mean, while the Teals haven't indicated that this is the case, that they could win. They could win a seat like Bennelong, for example.
Yeah,
they could snap that up from Labor.
Yeah.
They will be prominent. We know this.
So perhaps the Sydney fish market's no longer the end of the known world.
No, we're going well into the inner west, I think. They are going to be prominent in the Victorian state election as well, where they are going to contest Kew. I'd expect them to win Kew. I won't expect them to win Hawthorn, because the former Liberal member is actually a moderate and quite a decent fellow, former Attorney General. I think he'll be returned. But they're going to run in places like Brighton, Jack, where they could have a real impact again on the Liberal Party's ability to win seats. I guess what we can say is that in the long run, we're going to have bigger crossbenches than we've had before across our state and federal parliaments.
I think Victoria's a little bit of an outlier. With apologies to Bill Hayden, I think a drover's dog could beat the Liberal Party candidate.
That's your guy.
Yeah.
No, look, it is a party that is veered to the right. I mean, it's a party that has veered to the Christian right, if you like. I mean, in the state council, there's just a predominant number of Mormons there, which is hardly representative of Middle Australia, or the centre, as we like to say. So, I mean, if you wanted an example of how things can go badly wrong, if you do make these shifts, ideological shifts, the Victorian Liberal Party would be a pretty good example.
Do they go door knocking in pairs?
Would you like to come in for a tea or coffee? No. Can't do that.
In the sensible shoes and the crisp white short sleeve shirts.
The white shirt, yeah. Look, that could be happening. Yeah, so you can see what happened, and it happened actually in 2018 in the Victorian state election. There, they almost lost Brighton to a young fella who was the Labor candidate who was first year Melbourne Uni Law.
Yeah, he only just started.
He was ahead on the count overnight. Yeah,
23, I think he was, wasn't he?
Yeah, he mightn't have been first year, but he was pretty young, and he was ahead. He was ahead on the two-party preferred overnight. So what the Liberal Party has done even further to estrange itself from the community is basically, I think it's three elections now, three federal elections now, where the New South Wales body has basically had to step aside, and all the branches had to step aside while the political leadership, either from Canberra or from Sydney, had determined what the pre-selections of candidates were going to be.
Yeah, this is a bit of a problem for both the big political parties these days, is that as the membership of both those parties has diminished, the political nature of those memberships has shrunk, and it's shrunk away from the centre towards the edges. There's a bit of an argument, I think, that a US-style primary system might be better for electing candidates than our current setup. I mean, I know the Labor Party struggles with this as to how to pre-select people for suburban and middle ring seats without being run over by the socialist left types. You know?
By the factions generally. I mean, look, what we saw in Fowler was basically the old exercise of parachuting in a candidate and a factional deal in the form of Christina Keneally. It was a complete and utter disaster, and she lost a seat for Labor, which should not be lost. That's the point. And they had a very good local candidate, but they shot him down. The local Vietnamese lawyer, I believe, shot him down and parachuted Christina Keneally in, and it was a disaster. In Parramatta, there was some concerns about Andrew Boyd, Charlton Jack, the Kevin Rudd policy advisor, being parachuted into Parramatta. But he got home and he actually improved his standing, improved his primary vote, improved Labor's primary vote. And maybe there are some other factors just besides the individual candidate there.
What you mean besides him not being Christina Keneally?
Well, that might have been a decisive factor.
Yeah.
And look, there's a general view now that within the Labor Party that they copped their right whack.
So someone at headquarters said, just go out there to Parramatta and just, whatever you do, don't be Christina Keneally.
Well, it did. If that was the advice, it did seem to help. And look, the same thing happened to, well, you could say Gilmore times two. Now it's a very, very marginal seat that's been held by Labor since 2019. In 2019, the Liberal Party parachuted Mundine in which was a complete disaster because the branches in Gilmore all turned on him and actually ran their own candidate as an independent. So that was a complete and utter disaster. This time
he was a long-term Labor Party member who had a falling out with the Labor Party.
That's basically that's Warren Mundine's bio, isn't it? You know.
Yeah.
Spare our listeners from having to buy his biography, which he was pumping hard on Facebook for a very long time there. That's basically it. He was a disgruntled Labor man who wandered over to the North Shore and said, gee, it's really, really comfortable here, and married into a Liberal Party family. And, they have nicer cars and nicer furniture, and look at the size of that telly. And decided he liked...
And the wine at the Liberal Party functions, I'm sure, I've never been to one, but I guess I have been to one, but I'm sure it's better than the wine at the Labor Party.
Be better than the goon on offer at the Labor functions. So surely the answer, in short, Jack, is to get better candidates. You know, we're better and more attached to their communities. Those sorts of candidates, people who are well known in their communities, they're the ones that can't be overlooked, surely.
Yeah.
Yes, and look, this did lead to an email to Liberal Party members from New South Wales Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg and the Women's Council delegate Jane Bunkle. Senior Liberals will push to reduce the power of the party leader among a series of major changes to the way candidates are chosen in New South Wales, having overlooked the branch input for the last 3 federal elections, saying the pre-selection debacle under Scott Morrison must never happen again. What did they say there, Jack?
Well,
You've got
Jake,
the quote in front of you. Your rights as members.
yeah, your rights as members of our great party were taken away before the election. The Liberal Party is Australia's most successful grassroots movement, which I think is that's a bit of a stretch by a long way.
It's a little bit of a stretch. Auskick, mate. Now that's probably
That's
better.
a grassroots movement and
Yeah.
a well-run one.
Exactly.
Jane Bunkle's a bit of a rising star of the New South Wales bar. She's a barrister there, and
Right.
she was kind of the leading candidate for pre-selection in Warringah, Zali Steggall's seat. But she withdrew because of all the pre-selection shenanigans. She certainly would have done better than Catherine Deeds.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I can't imagine how anyone could have done worse.
All 3 of them are women barristers, I think, aren't they? Zali Steggall was a barrister before she was.
She definitely was. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
I
not
think
sure
Catherine
about
Deeds
Dee's
as well.
background.
Yeah.
It is not a dictatorship, the Liberal Party of Australia. Ooh. And we will not be successful without the engagement of you, our members. Your rights to have your say and select your candidates.
The factional
Sorry.
divvying up of candidates of pre-selections is fine when you've got really smart people running the factions. There are plenty of good examples where they've got it right, but it doesn't work all the time. And it doesn't work when you've got less talented people running the factions.
Yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, I spoke to a former Lib, or he's still involved in the party in Victoria, after Sophie Mirabella got punted out of Indi in 2013. And I was astonished, absolutely astonished to see in 2016 that she was pre-selected again. And I said, what's going on there? Surely you can't have her. She's been rejected by the people. It's hardly likely they're going to go, oh, we've made a mistake. We better vote you back in. And he said, oh, look, the local branches were just full of people who don't really understand what's going on, full of people a long way from what the people of Indi were thinking. And that's part of the problem too, that if you say that the factions aren't being well controlled, and they're certainly not in Victoria, then at branch level you've got people who are making bad decisions. It's almost like you do need some federal intervention.
Yeah, well, the factions in the federal parliamentary Labor Party worked quite well when you had hardheads like Robert Ray and Graham Richardson, running, the right faction, and some old hardheads running the left faction. It kind of worked because they tended to make good decisions. They tend to have good contacts all around the place to help them make good decisions, but these days, I just don't see the factional leadership being quite that quality.
Well, there's a lot of internecine brawling in New South Wales. In Victoria, there's less because those fights have already been won and lost. That the moderates are kind of on the outer now in the Liberal Party. So you've got a very strange situation there. All the polling tells us that Dan Andrews will be re-elected there. It's still a long way to go. Of course, we've still got 5 months to go, more than 5 months to go. But if you haven't got a substantial opposition against you, you're going to get voted in whether you're a good government or not.
Yeah, that's true.
Re-elected.
Yeah, is Chairman Dan waiting for the party congress to anoint him? Is he?
There was some really interesting federal election voting around his seat that showed a little bit of a shift to the Liberal Party. So I guess we can't say never, but look, all the Liberals are doing this time is 2018 all over again. Matthew Guy, they just said, well, if you didn't like the original, try the sequel because it's going to be exactly the same.
He's the bloke who was at the lobster restaurant, wasn't he? You know?
Yeah, he was the lobster with the mobster stuff. Yeah, there was all of that. And they spent their time talking about African crime gangs and all this sort of nonsense. I'd venture also that Peter Dutton won't be doing a lot of campaigning in Victoria either. He's not popular there. With these sort of exaggerated problems of crime and so forth, African crime gangs, ethnicity, Dutton weighed into all of that. And it was a disaster because I don't think people really want to hear negative stuff. I mean, they really don't want to be told. Well, they don't want to be told that their state's being run into the ground when they walk out their front door and say, the trains are running on time. Everything seems to be working pretty well. Whatever else I think about Dan, he's told me what he's going to do and how he's going to do it, and we've got 3 years of track record saying he's pretty close to that.
Oh, and they're building new train lines and all that sort of stuff. You and I can remember what a failing Labor government looks like.
That's just tram stands. Tram stands. Look, it's good to have trams on Spring Street, but not too many. Not 40. Not 40 stationary trams. Yeah,
I think we both became refugees in Victoria at the same time, didn't we?
And some of our friends in the Labor Party, the Victorian Parliament, would look out through the blinds from their offices and go, "Oh Jesus! Oh,
not good.
Are we going to get belted or not?" Yeah. So look, let's move on to the far more important business of government. And, of course, we know the Albanese, we spoke of that this last week, the Albanese cabinet. But we're talking, does size matter when it comes to cabinet, Jack? Because and one new Lord and Lion Eyes is the Hawke cabinet in 1983. If our listeners ever want a sense of talent assembled in one spot, it's a very good place to start looking. In that Hawke cabinet, there are only 15 members, Jack, and there were 12 in the outer ministry. The Albanese cabinet, and it's not unlike the Morrison cabinet in terms of size, is 23 and with 7 on the outer. Now, is that too big to be making good decisions, making these arguments, good cabinet-style government, with the minister making arguments and other people sitting around trying to knock him off or her off? 23, is that too big?
Yeah, I think it is. You've got to remember that first Hawke ministry, in the outer, not in the cabinet, in the outer ministry, there were people like Michael Duffy, Neil Blewett, Brian Howe,
Clyde Holding,
Kim Beazley, Clyde Holding, lots and lots of talent. Hawke was prepared to say, look, we know you're really good, we know you're really talented, we can't have too many around the cabinet table because it's just unwieldy.
That's the issue, isn't it? So, look, as I say, this is not something that's peculiar to the Albanese government. This is something that's probably been going on since, well, I guess even the Howard government, but certainly the Rudd government, where you had very large cabinets. So you've got 23 in there now, and 7 on the outer. In Hawke's day, it was 15 and 12. So the number of ministers really hasn't changed very much, but more of them are going into cabinet now, and that tends to make those things unwieldy.
It does. See, what happens with the outer ministers? They go to cabinet meetings when they've got a specific proposal, or there's a proposal that affects their department and their area. Mm-hmm. So they attend then, but they don't attend just as a matter of course, and that works better. I think health was an outer ministry in the first Hawke government. Neil Blewett had the health portfolio already, but he wasn't in cabinet.
Yeah, you can obviously see why health should be in the cabinet, but there are a lot of. It's not so much the quality of the portfolio. It's really that's not the issue. The issue is if you're going to have this sort of strident and vigorous debate about how to go forward in a particular portfolio or other, whether it be taxation or a reduction of services or an increase of services, or let's say how we go about the NDIS and those sorts of things. It's probably better handled with a smaller group rather than a large one.
Well, you just look at who's got to be in cabinet. Your Attorney General should be in cabinet. Your Treasurer's got to be in cabinet. Your Finance Minister's got to be in cabinet, and you've got to have a good one. Just think of Peter Walsh in the Hawke government. He kept
who
was
a great naysayer, and he would have infuriated people in the government, in the Hawke government at the time, but you needed that voice, didn't you? You needed that voice that would, that sought to control spending.
And you've got to have the Foreign Affairs Minister in there, and you've got to have whoever's responsible for national security, for the spy agencies, etc. They're all going to be in cabinet.
We sort of do have these smaller sub-cabinets now, don't we? We have a national security we have a national security committee.
Yes.
And then we'll have an expenditure review committee, which rolls around Treasurer, Finance. Prime Minister sits in all of them.
Yep.
Perhaps those things with a smaller cabinet you could do away. I understand there might be some national security issues that rely on top secret information and so forth that can't really be bandied around a cabinet table, even though you do have restraint on what cabinets can talk about. But maybe some of those sort of subgroups can go. I mean, if you're Prime Minister, you could literally be sitting in meetings all day.
You could. One of the things that hasn't happened with the Albanese government is they haven't done as good a job yet in aligning the cabinet positions and the ministry positions with the public service. There are too many departments who have multiple cabinet ministers. The infrastructure, transport, regional development, communications and the arts department will have 4 cabinet ministers. 2 of whom have major responsibilities, Michelle Rowland for communications and Catherine King for infrastructure, transport, regional development and local government. Social services will have 3 cabinet ministers, 2 with major responsibilities, Amanda Rishworth for social services and Bill Shorten for the NDIS. This just makes it too messy, too hard to get government departments and cabinet ministers to work well together. And this is in contrast to the Hawke, Keating and Howard governments, who were all good governments, all successful governments, who had a much better alignment between the public service and the ministries.
We haven't really seen the Night of the Long Knives either, have we? I mean, I think the only one I've seen
that's on its way.
It's got to be happening very soon. I noticed that Gary Johns has resigned, Jack. You remember Gary? He was a member of... it might have been the Outer Ministry.
He was Outer Ministry of
in the Keating government. Yeah. And he is, I'll just get his proper title, the Commissioner of the Australian Charities Charities are Not-for-Profits Commission. He has tendered his resignation, and that was, I think, somewhat gleefully received by the relevant minister. That's
there wasn't
Andrew
much
Leach.
Restraint in the press release, was there, of the glee?
No, thank you for doing what we were just about to do. That was that sense there. There has been a sense. I know
he was a Keating government minister who sort of found God at the IPA after they lost government.
Yeah, it was a bit of a transformation. He actually, he and I had a bit to do with one another when for columns that I was writing at the Australian, and look, he was I think very strong in terms of charities for jockeys, Jack, very strong. But there might be just. Look, I would think that sector needs to be looked at long and hard, particularly NPRs or NFPRs, but because there's some pretty shaky sort of stuff going on there, I think. But
here's an employment tip for our listeners: never go and work for a not-for-profit
Please
or
don't
a
do that.
trade union.
You,
Because,
yeah,
they have a Neanderthal approach to industrial human resources.
just in terms of management, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
I mean, it will cause you untold stress, and at the end of the day, you probably won't be very well remunerated. Although the unions might be a little bit different there, Jack, and you will find yourself, working among troglodytes. To the sort of day-to-day, Jack Albanese has visited Indonesia. I think he's on his way back now. He's confirmed his attendance at the G20, where Xi Jinping will obviously be in attendance, but also Vladimir Putin. How big's the table going to have to be?
He's probably going to have to do it by Zoom, I think, Vlad.
He's going to turn up. Of course, it's being hosted in Jakarta. The G20 is being hosted in Jakarta, and in this day and age, where, and not just with COVID, but because there is a fair amount of belligerence around the world at the moment, it was of great personal concern to Joko Widodo, that the G20 might end up being a large Zoom meeting rather than people turning up in Jakarta. So Albo's done that. How important is our relationship to Indonesia, Jack?
It's quite important. I mean, they're
probably
huge.
Certainly it's our most important regional relationship, I would think.
Yeah.
There is a view that was maintained around the Keating leadership and during his period as treasurer as well, is that, it's a country of 300 million people in between us and China.
Mm.
And that sort of, given that sort of strategic outlook. So it's a really, really important thing. Our trade with Indonesia is almost way too low, considering the proximity to Indonesia from Australia. Way too low. We trade probably about, I think it's about 5 times that with New Zealand. So there are opportunities there that seem to go begging.
Yeah, there are. We don't even do much in education between Australia and Indonesia, and that's a mistake.
That is seen more in the Philippines, more in Vietnam, more in China, more in Thailand. So yes, there's just so much potential in that relationship that's really not going forward. There is a free trade agreement which was actually negotiated during the Morrison years, and while I haven't had a good close look at it, it is time to start basically keying that in. Yeah, and to mutual benefit, really. The Indonesians and Australians will get a great deal of benefit from a closer relationship, free trade arrangements and all. And of course,
Keating worked hard to foster a close relationship with former President Suharto when he was Prime Minister.
Yeah, it's one of those sort of judgments that people make. The Suharto was a monster, and therefore the Australian government should have treated him, essentially ostracised him, and you just can't do that. We have to take Indonesia for good or bad. Now it's human rights and much improved. There are still some manifest problems, particularly in West Papua. You want to hear DFAT go quiet, Jack? You start talking about West Papua to them, they will just pretend it's not happening, because the relationship is so important to Australia, and those sorts of issues, where there are real human rights concerns in places like West Papua, the best place to talk about those things is not in a newspaper. It's not with the bullhorn on. It's done behind closed doors.
We always have to remember that, as in all these foreign relations situations, we have to deal with the Indonesia we've got, not the Indonesia we would like to have or perhaps want to have.
And you can make your representations, but just don't do it, in public. out loud and proud. Like a lot of our relationship has been with China, Jack. All done through the bullhorn, and maybe that's because they won't take our telephone calls anymore. But there was an incident over the weekend where the Chinese J-16 fighter placed the crew of an RAAF surveillance jet in jeopardy. They were flying over international seas and basically international territory, both craft. And according to former Air Force Chief Leo Davies, he said the behaviour of the Chinese jet fighter, China J-16 fighter, was as aggressive as I have heard of. So it's a little bit more saber rattling from China, Jack.
Yeah, well, I just think we've got to leave those kind of relationship problems. Again, as you said about Indonesia, we've got to leave those kind of things to the boffins behind closed doors to have it out.
Yeah. Anthony Albanese said it was a dangerous manoeuvre that threatened the lives of its crew. And the chief of the ADF, Angus Campbell, and Defence Secretary Greg Moriarty lodged furious protests with their People's Liberation Army counterparts.
And no doubt the ambassador will be called in for a chat, et cetera, and that's where it ought to be left.
Yeah, okay. All right. Overall, you've made the comment last week that Anthony Albanese had started really well. Overall, how do you see? He's had 2 international trips. Hasn't been home very long. Had the Quad meeting in Japan, and now his trip to Indonesia. How well's he going?
He's going okay, and I think with the proviso regarding the shape of the public service, I think the cabinet and the ministry look okay.
That is a tough one, isn't it? Because you've had 10 years of coalition government, so naturally the bureaucracy and the agencies are going to be pretty heavily politicised.
Yeah, well, certainly at the top level, that's true, and that's become that's sort of, at least from the Whitlam era on, being getting worse and worse all the time. I've got to say. So
there'll be a few people told to pack their gear in little cardboard boxes and marching out of, let's say, Border Force, or in fact Home Affairs, Treasury. And the PMO, well, that's already begun, hasn't it?
Yeah. And that's fair enough. That's fine.
Oh, it has to be. I mean, the political leaders have to have confidence in the people that they are almost in constant contact with about how their policy changes are going to flow through into the system.
Ideally, you keep enough of the long-term people in the public service so you've got some corporate memory, so that the next brilliant bad idea that someone has, there's someone who's been there long enough to say, look, we tried that about 25 years ago and it just didn't fly.
Yeah. Nugget Coombs.
Yeah.
One of the great bureaucrats, one of the great public servants of our time. There have been many, of course, and those are the people you want to keep. The political appointees, hit the road, Jack.
Yeah, which is fair enough. That's fine. They'll all go off and write. Well, this lot probably won't go off and write for pearls and irritations, because that's sort of like a university newspaper for older people. Everyone's on the left, but there'll be a right-wing version of pearls and irritations. For listeners, Pearls and Irritations is put together by John Menninger, who was a distinguished public servant.
Another great public servant, yes.
It's worth you. You should tip some money into it, because you can find some interesting stuff out.
Well, it's kind of the way Australia works. That's the beauty of that. I mean, it's basically how Australia works.
Yeah. That's if you've got any money left over from subscribing to our podcast.
yes, we'd like to do that first.
Yeah.
One issue that we haven't got into very much is since the election is polling. Now, you're perhaps not quite as fixated upon it as I am, as a bit of a pundit. I tended to give it the flick since 2019. That's not that I completely ignore it, but
I don't work for an organisation who's paying them, so you've got more skin in the game than I've got.
That's right. I mean, look, I'm looking at betting markets as a again nowhere near infallible device for predicting outcomes, but probably a little sounder than polling is at the moment. We saw most of the major polling companies. In fact, I think all of them. No one got anywhere near the reduction in both major parties' primary votes. And the other thing that they seem to have got horribly wrong. I mean, Newspoll had Morrison on a negative 13 approval rating, but it would seem to me that he was way more unpopular than that. Now, polling methodology aside, is this just a case of when you ring someone, a respondent, a polling company gets in touch with them and says, "What do you think of Scott Morrison?" And they say, "Well, I could, I could tell you, but I'm too nice. I'm too nice a person to tell you what I really think of Scott Morrison." Because I think a lot of that went on.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
And that lovely voice, this lovely lady's talking to me on the phone. I mean, most of these things aren't robopolls. They're conducted with a much broader methodology now in terms of getting hold of people who just don't have landlines, talking to people on mobile phones, talking to people, a consistent group of people on the internet and so forth. And I think, there are some problems with bias in terms of in-person polling. One of the Morgan polls, it's a bit of a standard of theirs, in-person polling. So if I talk to you and say, "What do you think of Scott Morrison?" you might be too nice to actually tell me. And then you might be, while you're really thinking, "Well, I'm going to vote, I'm going to do what I can to vote these people out." And they say, "Well, what would you like, Labor or Liberal or UAP, Green?" And you go, "Well, Liberals, maybe they're worth a chance." Is that the problem there, that we're just not getting genuine responses from respondents?
Well, I think it's fair to say right around the world, the polling companies haven't caught up with the change in personal behaviour. It was easier when everyone was at home watching the same television station every night and had a landline.
Yeah.
And they haven't quite come to terms yet with that, and that makes their product, I would think, harder to sell.
Yes, look, we also saw the Australian featured a really interesting piece of polling, and that was a YouGov poll that, and not a news poll, and that looked at all 151 electorates with 19,000, almost 20,000 respondents. But if you divide that by 151, it's not very many. It's about 120 odd people per seat. And while they got a fair bit right, they didn't go anywhere near what was right in terms of the Teals in New South Wales. That alone, disastrously wrong at. And so one thing that I would always caution people about is individual seat polling. It's generally never comprehensive enough to pick up any real trends. And you could find yourself, if you asked 125 people of 120,000 seat 120,000 people electorates, you can go so wrong there with just huge margins of error.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what do we do, Jack? Do we just look at the betting markets? Because I tell you what, I did all right this year. I did all right on the betting markets this year. And I think we've tipped a few of our listeners into some wins there. We did, I did in my column recommend the Greens. I know you were emotionally attached there in Brisbane to Madonna Jarrett, the Labor candidate, but I did think the Greens were a chance at I think they were 8-1. The 10 Independents Plus was another recommendation of mine, and people have spoken about that, and that paid $9. Maybe we should just be going with the betting markets, Jack.
It could be. I will be interested to see what your employer does with this. I wouldn't like to be walking in there with my presentation to say, look, you should keep giving us money in the polling business. You know?
Yeah, there's going to have to be some changes there, and they have. I mean, that's the thing. They you know, I had a long.
Someone's going to get this right. Someone's going to work out how to do this with the new reality, but they just haven't done it yet.
Yeah, it's really tough, and a lot of them have got, a lot of them have got great mathematical and statistical backgrounds, profound educations in that area. And look, I did talk to the head of Newspol about 3 or 4 months ago, and he gave me the rundown of what they were doing that was different from 2019, where it was all a bit of a disaster, and they were closer. You would have to say they were closer, but they got the primary vote. Newspol got the primary vote hideously wrong. I think they were into the 70s when really we got, the two parties combined primary votes were well into the 70s on their count, and really we were mid-60s, and that's a big variation.
Yeah. As I say, I think someone will work out a better way of doing this, but that just hasn't happened yet.
I think one of the things we are seeing that is useful is if you have a set group of, let's say, 1,500 people that you can connect with on the internet, that you can ask questions through the internet, and that is a broad variety of people, then you'll start seeing some better information. That's the way I'd be taking it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. We know that party focus groups are more accurate than the polls.
Yeah. Where perhaps people aren't so reserved about telling people what they really think. It's clear to me that Scott Morrison was perhaps the most unpopular leader since McMahon.
Well, and I think the party focus groups were telling them that. Hence, we had the "I'm going to change." I promise, darling, I'm going to be different. I'm going to change.
He did do that, didn't he? Mm-hmm. And it was quite. I mean, look, he was running the campaign. You can forget about the campaign managers and all that sort of stuff. He was running it his way because I think he thought he was, some sort of electoral mandrake who could pull a victory out of the fire, as he sort of did in 2019, forgetting that the big problem there for Labor was, in 2 words, Bill Shorten. There were some really astonishing things there. He went to Reid, which is a Western Sydney seat, and the sitting Liberal member was Fiona Martin, and he went and campaigned there, and she wasn't even invited. She wasn't invited to walk the streets of Canada Bay, etc., with him.
Yeah, no, I think he might have just shaded past Malcolm Turnbull as the worst Liberal campaign run since
in recent times.
Since Billy McMahon. Just one thing I want to ask you about, because and I haven't forewarned you about this because you work for the evil empire for
I don't call him that, Jack.
Yeah, for the Murdoch empire. Well, I've got to keep him good with the rest of the population, and with left Twitter, who clearly think they're legal. This happens post every time Labor wins an election, that left Twitter, which is kind of an oxymoron, really, isn't it? They go a bit nuts, and they're now saying that the Murdoch people should be banned from the ABC.
Oh, is that the push? Is it?
This is the latest push that now that we've got a proper government, there is no room.
Is this an insiders thing? Is it driven by the insiders?
It's insiders, it's Q&A, it's the drum. You used to be on the drum.
I used to do the drum. Came that up as a bad joke. And I do turn up on the insiders because I'm a big close friend and fan of Mike Bowers.
Mike Bowers, yeah.
And producer Fiona Katauskas. That's why I do that. It's the only bit of television that I really do.
Yeah, but left Twitter over the last 3 or 4 days has been full of this, that it's now time to make a stand and make sure that there are no people who work for Murdoch allowed on the ABC at all. It's not only have we won the election, but we want to control the way people think.
Well, there is, of course, a bit of a push backed by Malcolm Turnbull and Kevin Rudd to hold a royal commission into News Corp, which is bizarre. I'd be happy to give evidence there, by the way, if that ever happened. But it's bizarre because it's hardly reflective of a free press, is it? I mean, here is we don't like what we're hearing from one group, so we're going to stomp all over them. It's a form of McCarthyism, a form of left-wing McCarthyism. That's how I often describe it. I do encounter a bit of this on Twitter from time to time. Others cop it much worse, I must say. But the whole point of this is, and I tell people this, and it either goes in one ear and out the other, or they just choose to ignore it. Every time I write a column for The Australian, I start with a blank piece of paper and no advice on what I should be writing. And if I receive some feedback, and I should, from my editor from time to time, it's generally loved your column today, mate. Well done, So I don't feel any sense of control. I do not receive an email all in caps from Rupert Murdoch at the start of every day. It's just a nonsense. And furthermore, with that blank sheet of paper that I fill in to the extent of about 1,500 words every or twice a week, going on from that, if I did that at another media organisation, I guarantee you I would have way more editorial intervention, and I can speak from experience at the ABC, to a degree at Fairfax, albeit some time ago, and from independent media, where probably more editorial influence is more intrusive than anywhere else, possible exception the ABC. So there you go.
The dirty little secret is, of course, that the people who are on left Twitter don't want you starting with a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah, I guess that's it. Yeah,
I mean, they actually have an approved. They're more Catholic than the Catholics. They're more Catholic than the Pope these days. They have their own little they have their own little canon of beliefs that are acceptable, and you must not stray from that.
Yeah, like I say, I've actually had a couple of swipes at people over the journey. I tend to avoid Twitter conflict because it's rather pointless. But I've described, and I've just come straight out about it. Your view is a McCarthyist view of the world. Are you now, or have you ever been a subscriber to News Corp or a contributor to News Corp? Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of thought that's going on here.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh well, look, I may never appear on the ABC again, Jack. Oh, woe is me. I'll cry, for a couple of nights, lose a couple of nights' sleep, but then I'll be okay. Yeah. I doubt that the ABC be silly enough to pick up on that.
No. There's just enough sensible people there.
Yeah, well, you'd like to think so. We do have a listener inquiry, which we're delighted to take, and we encourage them, by the way. So we've got a little letter here from Tom. And now Tom lives in the seat of Hinkler in and around Bundaberg in Queensland, regional Queensland seat. And he's asked us to explain, and he says the third most popular candidate was the current mayor of Bundaberg, Jack Dempsey. It seems he put, this is according to Tom, being a mayor off to one side to be an independent candidate. And now the election is over. He has gone back to being mayor again and just seems to be acting like business as usual. So
it was won by the Lib, wasn't it, this seat, Hinkler?
It was won by the LNP, Keith Pitt, won by the sitting LNP member, Keith Pitt. He did experience a 4.4 swing against him, and due mainly to the intervention of Jack Dempsey. Or that's the way it appears, Jack. So Tom was wondering, hey, to the mayor of Bundaberg, how come you had a crack? You've caused a bit of consternation to one of your former colleagues because Jack Dempsey was an LNP member for Bundaberg in the state parliament. police minister in the Newman government. So is he just causing a few problems? So I went and had a look at the numbers, Jack, and you've seen them too. In Hinkler, you've got a 4% swing against Keith Pitt, the sitting member. You've got UAP with a few more votes than normal, well than last time. They're up 3%. One Nation down, which is pretty much a bit of a standard for Queensland, down 6%. The Australian Labor Party vote was basically status quo on 2019, and Greens got about 5.5%, and Jack Dempsey here got 13,000 votes, or 13% of the vote.
He didn't really harm Keith Pitt, though, did he?
I would say he's given him a helping hand,
He might have, yeah.
Because when we look at these, and I don't have the preference breakdowns to hand, but in the end, two-party preferred. Keith's won the seat 60-40 against Labor, with just 42% of the primary vote. So obviously he's picked up some preferences from the United Australia Party and some from One Nation, who got 7 and 8% of the vote respectively. And then we've got Jack the Independent. I'd suggest that those preference flows were going probably about 90. I'm guessing, but 90-10 towards Keith Pitt. Now you might say that Jack might have been parachuted in there to help Keith along.
Could the fix have been in? Maybe. Yeah.
Fix might well have been in. The issue of him being mayor, and I was wondering this too, Jack, before we started the program, talk to you about it. As mayor, he would not fall under Section 44 issues in terms of being basically on the salary of the Commonwealth. Because as mayor, the Commonwealth has no status over local government. So there's no Section 44 issues that I can think of. And so he's more than entitled to resume his work after sort of stepping down for a period of time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I wasn't around at the time, but I've certainly read that Ben Chifley, even when he was Prime Minister, retained his seat on the Bathurst Council, and indeed used to pop across for the odd council meeting.
Well, and another bit of trivia for you, Jack. Billy Hughes, he was briefly a state member of Parliament in New South Wales and a federal member of Parliament. And when Australia's first Parliament sat in Melbourne, he remained a sitting member in the state New South Wales Parliament for about 6 or 7 months, I believe.
Billy Hughes, who, when asked, it was pointed out to him that he'd been a member of every political party in Australia at the time, except the Country Party. And he was asked why that was, and he says, "Well, a bloke's got to have some principles."
Also, my very favourite Ben Chifley story is that in his office in the old Parliament House, Prime Minister's office in the old Parliament House, the number on the phone, I think it was about 5 digits in those days, was very close to a butcher shop in Monica. And it was very common for the Prime Minister of the day, Bill Chifley, old Chiff himself, to pick up the phone and to have a housewife recite the meat order for the week, and to his considerable credit, he used to take the orders down and then just pass them to the secretary, who'd ring it through to the butcher shop in Monica. It may not have been. I don't think in this day and age that would be all that acceptable. But it just shows you what a terrific bloke he was.
Not much chance of the PM picking up the phone personally these days. For our listeners, I recommend you stay at the Currachong Hotel in Canberra.
Yes.
I've done that a couple of times, and almost no matter which room you get there, they'll tell you you're sleeping in Bill Shipley's Ben Shipley's old room.
Yeah. So, old Ben's bed, which used to get a bit of a workout. But that's another story,
All right,
Jack.
yeah.
We're going to wrap it up there. And thanks so much for your time today. And thank you. Thank you, Tom, our listener, for our listener letter, and we would welcome those in future. And
The more the better.
The more the better. We will certainly deal with as many as we can, and we'd also encourage, as we said at the front of the show, that you give us a bit of a boost if you can on social media. Give us a rating on your favourite podcast app, or drop us a line at the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com, or you can see me on Twitter. My DMs are always open. Fantastic to have you along, Jack. And we look forward to catching up later in the week with the two Jacks around the world. But we will be going into week 10 of Hard Hats and High Vis next Monday. All the best, mate.
Cheers.
Thank you, listeners. See ya.